Professor Dungeonmaster here. I just finished reading this great book, Slaying the Dragon by Ben Riggs. It's the secret history of Dungeons & Dragons, and it covers the 80s and 90s TSR's rise to fame and power and its eventual collapse. And I'm going to get the review part out of the way right now. This is a great book, really plainly written and straightforward with short chapters, with dozens of interviews of the people who worked at TSR so they could tell their stories for the first time from the inside of what really happened. I wrote for TSR and Dungeon Magazine back in the 1990s, and I aspire to be a professional game designer. It's even in the bio of one of my early publications. And little did I and everyone else know that the company was nearly bankrupt when those issues were published in the mid-90s. It was a secret hidden from everybody. But what caused the collapse of the greatest game company of all time? And could it happen again? We're going to go over that today in this video. And it's not just a review. The review part is pretty much out of the way. It's a great book. You should really get it. It makes a great Christmas gift for any gamer. And I think all gamers should know the history of the game that we enjoy so much. But more than that, it's going to be my personal analysis of what went on, my interpretation of the events. And forgive me if I talk quickly, because there's a lot of things to go over. There's not one person or event that destroyed TSR. It's a complex relationship between ideas. And this book cleared up many of the misconceptions that I had. But before we get to that, I'm going to ask you to subscribe if you like the latest in news, reviews, and whether you play OSE or 5e. If you're interested in Dungeons & Dragons, you want to subscribe to this channel. I also share my campaign design process in my Reviled Society videos. Here are a few scenes. I use scenery and miniatures to tell the story of my group's adventures, and I think you'll really enjoy them. Click on them. They'll be at the end of this video. So the first suspects we have to look at are the original leadership team. Brian Bloom, Kevin Bloom, and Gary Gygax. They ran TSR as a triumvirate, but none of them had any business experience. They didn't have MBAs. They didn't even have BAs. The Bloom brothers were there because their father had bought a 50% share in the company. In the latter half of the 70s and early 80s, D&D sales were explosive, peaking in 1983, when the combined sales of the Dungeons & Dragons and Advanced Dungeons & Dragons rule systems topped $1.8 million. TSR employees swelled to over 300, and Gygax and the Blooms thought they were on track to be the next Parker brothers. But many of the sales were fueled by the novelty of the game and the satanic panic of the early 80s. In 1984, rule sales dropped to only 800,000 units, and management was forced to lay people off. Gygax had moved to LA to try to get D&D made into a movie, blowing about $500,000 hiring A-list screenwriter William Goldman, author of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid and The Princess Bride, to write the screenplay that, by all accounts, was terrible and went unproduced. All we got was a Saturday morning cartoon show that lasted 27 episodes. The LA branch, called TSR West, overpaid for IP crossovers like Conan the Barbarian, which coincided with the inferior film sequel Conan the Destroyer, Indiana Jones, and bizarrely 2001: A Space Odyssey. And I'm probably one of the few people that own a copy of this module. Don't get me wrong, I love the film now as an adult, but as a kid, compared to the action of Star Wars, it was really slow moving. One of the people that Gary met when he was out there was a guy named Flint Dill, and you may not know his name, but you know his work if you watch G.I. Joe and Transformers. In the early 80s, he wrote many of the episodes, and the G.I. Joe character Flint is named after him. But Flint Dill introduced Gary Gygax to his sister Lorraine Williams, who did have a background in business, and Gary sent her to Wisconsin to sort of straighten out the company. And she did. She bought out the Bloom brothers and got a majority shareholder position in the company and forced Gygax out. And by 1985, she was running the whole company. History may have cast Lorraine Williams as the villain in the piece. I mean, Gygax and his close friends did. But Ben Riggs does a fair job of evaluating her contributions to the company. He asked her to interview for this book. Her brother Flint Dill did, but she declined. But Riggs does a compelling job of making the case that she was instrumental, at least for a time, in the company's success. She discovered geniuses like Weiss and Hickman and hired them to write the Dragonlance modules and novels, turning TSR into a New York Times best-selling publishing juggernaut. By the end of the early 90s, TSR sold more novels than games. And she didn't spare money when it came to artists. So many iconic D&D artists: Larry Elmore, Jeff Easley, Clyde Caldwell, Brom, Tony Dieter, were all hired by Lorraine Williams. And hired design veteran Zeb Cook to spearhead a second edition of Dungeons & Dragons, ending the sales slump. But there were also issues. Second edition D&D only did half the numbers of the first edition, and the many campaign worlds cannibalized each other, dividing the fan base. Greyhawk players wouldn't buy modules set in Forgotten Realms, and Forgotten Realms players wouldn't buy modules set in Greyhawk. And the second edition didn't sell nearly as well as the first edition. That was one of the misconceptions that was cleared up for me. I mean, having written for second edition, I assumed it was just as popular. When I went to conventions like Gen Con, everyone was playing it. Like, everyone left first edition behind. But the fact is, second edition only sold about half those numbers. The D&D brand was broken up into two lines: Dungeons & Dragons and Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. This was done to avoid paying royalties to D&D co-creator Dave Arneson, the pretense being that Dungeons & Dragons and Advanced Dungeons & Dragons were completely different games. But it confused consumers and limited sales. I remember as a kid, my friends did not want to play anything with just Dungeons & Dragons. They thought that that was for babies. And Williams was good at discovering talents, but not good at retaining them. They hired Weiss and Hickman to do the Dragonlance books, for which they were paid something like $10,000 for that trilogy. When those books were successful, Bantam Publishing offered Weiss and Hickman $90,000 for the Dark Sword trilogy. That's $30,000 a book. Unsurprisingly, Weiss and Hickman left and struck out on their own, so they needed not only new writers, but a new campaign world to replace Kryn. So they bought the Forgotten Realms setting from Ed Greenwood for about $4,000 or $5,000 and hired him to oversee that project. They started the Forgotten Realms series of novels starring Drizzt Do'Urden, created by R.A. Salvatore. And just like Weiss and Hickman before him, R.A. Salvatore's book shot to the top of the New York Times bestseller list and made Drizzt an iconic Dungeons & Dragons character. But then they underpaid him, and he threatened to walk. It was a case of Lorraine Williams thinking that the IP Dungeons & Dragons was really what was selling the books, not the authors themselves. And this created what I call a brain drain, where the most talented people often left the company for greener pastures. Riggs refers to these early authors and designers as geniuses, and I agree with him. And one of those geniuses was Bruce Nesmith, whose name you may not know, but he designed the original Ravenloft, and in my opinion, still the best version of Ravenloft. And he went on to design a little game called Skyrim Elder Scrolls. Then we have the Dragon Strike debacle. Lorraine Williams and the management team thought that they had to simplify Dungeons & Dragons to introduce it to newer players at a younger age. So they introduced this game called Dragon Strike, which is really a sort of hero questy type of Dungeons & Dragons game. And it came with a very innovative feature, a video cassette that taught you how to play so you didn't have to read the rules. And the target audience was like 8-year-olds. So they get this video cassette, and I'll include a link to the video below. It's absolutely hilarious. Like, the barbarian looks like the guy from Ice House, you know, that song Electric Blue. And it's really over the top and acting, and it's really surprisingly gory for a thing aimed at kids. People get beheaded, sexual innuendos. It's really inappropriate. And the narration is absolutely goofy. But nevertheless, Dragon Strike was initially a hit. It sold 100,000 copies, and it was expensive. Lorraine Williams asked Jim Ward, their head of creative design, how many should we order for a second printing? And Ward sensibly answered, about 50,000 copies, because the second printing never sells as many as the first. But she ordered 150,000, and it wasn't a mistake. She didn't hear the number wrong. It had to do with a practice called factoring. Distributors would buy TSR products at a discounted rate in January and not have to pay until those items were shipped. They would sign a contract. TSR would take the contract to an investment bank and sell it to them. The bank would then pay TSR a year of money up front, about 82% of the sales price. When the product was sold, the buyers would pay back the investment bank instead of TSR. So why would TSR only want 82 cents on the dollar? Well, it's simple. They would get it all in a lump sum payment and be able to make their payroll and plan out their scheduled releases for the year. The problem is it locked TSR into that schedule for the year. If TSR produced 50,000 copies of the Buck Rogers role-playing game, and yes, that really was a thing because the Dill family owned the IP for Buck Rogers. So let's just say that's the number, 50,000, and it doesn't sell, which it didn't. It would just sit on the shelves. There was no way to cut back on production. They had to schedule that production at the start of the year. If they produced something that was successful, such as the Spellfire card game, which was TSR's answer to Magic, they couldn't print more because, again, they were locked in to those manufacturing decisions they made at the start of the year. So it made the company inflexible, producing too many things that didn't sell and not enough of the things that were selling. More problems. They created, and this was very innovative as well, a CD-ROM that would teach you the Dungeons & Dragons rules. Great idea. They partnered with a distributor called Babbage's. It was a computer software store that was like in every mall in America. But just as those CDs arrived, Babbage's declared bankruptcy as soon as they received the shipment, and they marked those CD-ROMs down to just $1, leading to the perception that the product was junk. TSR's main distributor, Random House, returned over $14 million worth of product, and they kept restructuring the debt and barely making the payments. They couldn't pay their printer, so they sold him the company building, making their printer their landlord. And when they couldn't pay him anymore, he stopped printing their products. Rounds of layoffs occurred, and they were left with a skeleton crew in a mostly empty building. Enter Peter Adkison and Wizards of the Coast. Wizards of the Coast had had explosive growth because of the Magic collectible card game, and Adkison heard that TSR was in trouble and made overtures to buy them. At first, Williams rebuffed his attempts, saying the company was fine, but eventually she had to acquiesce, and Adkison bought the company and eventually sold Wizards of the Coast to Hasbro for $310 or $350 million. It was a lot of money. So, can it happen again? Here are the similarities. Overproduction of Magic cards. That 30th anniversary booster pack that's $1,000 with cards you can't officially play. That's angered fans. Oversaturation of D&D products. There seemed to be a new book every 2 months. Recent releases like Spelljammer seem rushed. It's a sci-fi setting that doesn't include spaceship combat. Paying too much for crossover IPs like Warhammer. Then there's the pandemic bump. Just like the Satanic Panic artificially fueled sales in the early 80s, the pandemic and the popularity of shows like Big Bang Theory and Stranger Things has fueled the sales of Magic and D&D, perhaps to unsustainable levels. A slowdown is inevitable, and Wall Street has noticed downgrading the stock to sell. But there are big differences. Lorraine Williams wasn't a gamer and didn't know what was cool. She dismissed Magic the Gathering and insisted on sinking resources into the Buck Rogers role-playing game, long after that character's peak popularity in the 30s. Hasbro CEO Chris Cox plays Dungeons & Dragons. He started as president of Wizards of the Coast, and his pick to lead the D&D team, Dan Rawson, is also a Dungeon Master. These guys know what they sell, why it's cool, and who plays the game. They also have MBAs and cut their teeth at Microsoft, one of the world's most successful companies. These people are pros and know how to make money. So even if D&D has peaked for the time being, long-term I believe they're well positioned to adapt to the change in consumer demand. I know some people are hostile to the idea that One D&D is heading in a digital direction, but the acquisition of D&D Beyond will allow Wizards of the Coast to become its own distributor, and it's debt to printers and distributors that really killed TSR. Plus, the Bloom brothers, Gary Gygax and Lorraine Williams were working in a time when these games were new. They couldn't learn from the past because it didn't exist. But moving forward, Hasbro can. So no, I don't think Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro is ever going to go broke like TSR. But that's what I think. What do you think? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Also below you'll find links to Facebook, Patreon, if you want to support my work, and links to my games, Deathbringer and the Eldritch Hack, and you can get Ben Riggs' Slaying the Dragon wherever books are sold. And if you like great tips and storytelling, check out my Reviled Society episodes right here. I'll see you soon. May all your rolls be 20s.
still think it's boring? Now get Deathbringer and watch more Dungeon Craft.